only somebody like my mother would be proud of that introduction. So, I first wanted to say thank you for inviting me to come and talk to you tonight. In particular, thank you to Amnon for organizing this event twice in 1 week. I arrived over the weekend, was here Monday. You had a small conflict on Tuesday that evidently shut down the university, so I went paddleboarding. So it's curious how it works in Israel. It's quite confusing that when you have a conflict that you go to the beach. So I'd like to tell you a bit about my work, and I'm also particularly honored to be talking with Steve. Steve's a friend who's been to our university. We're particularly excited about having the Non-Human Rights Project at the University of Denver and doing work together. So my goal tonight is to really tell you a bit about some of the concepts that I've encountered over the work that I've done. I'm a social worker, a social scientist by training. Most of my work has really been focused in this intersection between people and animals. And there's many dimensions to this work, but I hope, and I'm not entirely sure whether it contributes or is helpful to the work that somebody like Steve is doing, or at times detrimental to it because of the way we may think about our relationship with animals. So I'll leave that to our discussion afterwards in some ways. So we'll start by, I just want to start by suggesting that all animals are important. I'm particularly obsessed with squirrels right at the moment, actually. They're one of the most amazing animals. In fact, there's so many interesting facts about squirrels, including things like their teeth grow their whole life. Things like that. So thank you to the university for having me, and to my host. I've been treated so well. So I'm the executive director of an institute called the Institute for Human-Animal Connection, and we focus in 3 primary areas as a program. We look at the health-promoting benefits that having connection to animals provide us. We're very interested in the role that animals play in our communities, including the positive sides of that as well as the negative sides of that. So we run a cruelty clinic at the University of Denver that includes providing the courts with forensic animal maltreatment evaluations that assist judges in how to provide accurate dispositions in animal cruelty cases. And then we're also interested in what we sometimes call conservation social work, or One Health, and I'll explain that here in just a little bit more detail. One of the areas that we've become really interested in is the connection between biodiversity health and human health. And as we started to study this dimension, both on kind of micro levels, but also on meso and macro levels, turns out that we're highly interconnected, and these are significant reasons for us to be interested in this topic. As it turns out, cruelty is not without consequence on so many different levels that as we begin to examine or unpackage the ways in which we become callous to other non-human animals, what we'll find is that it not only has, significant implications for those that we're cruel to, but also has significant detriment to us as well. One of the dimensions of this concept emanates from the concept of the biophilia hypothesis, or this recognition that for optimum human health, we also need to be connected to other living systems. Now, this has been documented in many different contexts, but one of the most famous was Edward Wilson's book, The Biophilia Hypothesis, where he began to identify in comprehensive ways how these were predictors of our own well-being. It also suggests maybe why we have such interest in things like pet keeping, for example. At our university, we now have numerous courses that have begun to pair specializations in our understanding and connection and relationship with animals to terminal degree programs. So, for example, you can get a graduate degree and have a specialization as a social worker, or as a lawyer, or as a psychologist, or as an educator. So I work in the Graduate School of Social Work, but these are working across campuses. We also have distance learning programs and now have students on every continent in the world, with the exception of Antarctica, in fact. We're looking for our first Antarctican, so we could say we're worldwide. These are dogs that started in Denver, but in fact Kelly now works in Singapore, and Afra over here is with Maria Jose, who's a Costa Rican psychologist. Now, so the point, in a way, is that these are now concepts that are relevant to the entire world. Israel is really a leader in many regards in the roles that animals can play in all different types of human health endeavors. We run a program called the Canine Assisted Intervention Specialist Program that looks specifically at the roles dogs can play in human health. In fact, I noticed I'm still wearing my armband from the Harmoun prison in northern Israel. I hope I'm not taken as an escapee. So we were there today looking at the prison dog program that was started 3 years ago by an initiative here in Israel to begin to look at how to save dogs' lives by pairing them with rehabilitation efforts of inmates in that particular facility. Horses are another animal that can provide tremendous therapeutic value, so we have a specialization in equine mental health. And most recently, we've published and are now running a program called Raising Compassionate Children, which is looking at the ways in which we might influence educators and parents to teach young children to have or rethink their relationships with other non-human animals. Our research agenda is growing at the University of Denver. One of the places that we're doing quite a bit of research is for the Humane Society of the United States and their Pets for Life program. And we refer to this as social science informed animal welfare. And what we have started to recognize is that predictors of animal welfare are also good predictors of other kinds of human health and human well-being, including things like where we find veterinary deserts. We also find metrics that suggest problems for animals, but these also tend to predict problems for people. So as we start to look at working with communities, one of the ways to think about improving really improving the health and well-being of communities across this kind of One Health triad is to be interested in this particular connection. So this is literally a program where we go door to door, find out who has animals and what are the influences that allow for improving health in these communities. As it turns out, when we do that, when we improve the health of animals, we also improve the health and well-being of human beings in those communities. Another major research project that's occurring is at a program called Green Chimneys in Brewster, New York. And Brewster, New York is about an hour outside of Denver, or outside of New York City, and it's one of the oldest programs of this sort. What we're looking at in this particular program is we're studying the role that animals play in self-regulation. And this is, as we talk about this a little bit further tonight, what we have found is that the presence of animals that are well cared for begin to provide significant health-promoting benefits to children who are quite dysregulated. So I'll talk more about this as we go. This really becomes a predictor of what we call positive youth development, which are the protective factors, or the factors that now have likelihood of predicting good outcomes for children in this particular facility. And it's a very interesting program. If you're ever in New York, it might be worth a visit. We're studying the role that animals can play with incarcerated populations. These are actually both pictures of the program here in Israel, as well as the program we have in Denver, and have published a book recently, or a best practices guide for the development of these programs. Now, these are programs that have opportunities to both save animal lives and in doing so also have the impact of making prisons safer places. They improve the outcomes in these particular correctional settings. They don't have to be dogs, however. We're also studying a program in Washington State University, for example, that is raising endangered butterflies and beginning to work in areas of conservation science by teaching inmates to raise endangered frogs, for example, and reintroducing them into the ecological systems in the northwest of the United States. We've been studying animals now across the lifespan, and as it turns out, these are issues that help us actually achieve developmental objectives across the lifespan. So for example, for those of you who are raising children in your home, often the first reciprocal playmate for a child growing up in a home with animals is not a human playmate, but is maybe a non-human playmate. So the ways in which we're interacting and treating those animals are often predictors of the psychological and developmental achievements that those children will make. Now, all the way to the other end of the lifespan, we know that now we have persons whose end-of-life care, even hospice care, often includes a request that their non-human animals are present at their death. So animals play different developmental roles for human beings across the entire human lifespan, which indicates that they're critical members, critical relationships for us at each stage of our life. So there's this framework or a term, and I mentioned this last night at a meeting we had. This is a picture of coal miners about to lower a canary into the coal mine to determine whether the air is breathable at the bottom of the coal mine. So we have this term called a canary in the coal mine, or a canary in the mine. That is intended to say or frame a metaphor that animals are often, the well-being of animals are often predictors for our own health. We know this on many different levels, so I just wanted to show you some of the other ways we've been looking at this issue. Through one of the NIH grants that we've done at the University of Denver, we studied children, through about 300 families where children were co-exposed to violence in their family and violence directed at the animals that were living in this home. These now, what the study began to suggest is that these were predictors of risk factors for children's psychological health. Simultaneously, living with that animal also serves as a protective factor for those children, meaning that these relationships have real significance both in the health dimensions and potential risk factors associated with exposure to cruelty towards animals. This is kind of how children often feel in these homes, where they're often attached to these animals in many different ways. They actually often see themselves as the animal. We have pictures that children draw often where they only draw a portion of their body, for example, and place themselves in the animal's physical body. They're so connected to these animals. Many children see the animals they're growing up with as siblings. So what's the impact of a child who may have that animal kicked across the living room on a routine basis, or routinely treated in harsh or callous ways? What we believe is that these are then significant tools for also improving parenting, the health and well-being of communities where we have animals, and we are talking about with companion animals, prevalence that makes most other healthcare interventions actually small in comparison. In the United States, we have nearly 75 million owned dogs that are living in homes currently, more cats than dogs. So if these are predictors of child psychological health and development, what we want to be aware of is on a significant level, these are our teaching tools. These have resulted now in new scholarship in this area. These are both books that were published by the National Institute for Health and Child Development. In fact, the editors of these books are all NIH program officers and are beginning to document the science of the human-animal connection. At the University of Denver, we've become interested in the concept of turning universities into vehicles for humane practices, and really seeing universities as strategies or potentially catalysts for this kind of change. I think Tel Aviv University is probably a good candidate for this same concept. Or what would it mean to look at the entire university as being a humane university, not just a particular department or particular faculty members' scholarship or research, but what would it mean for this to be a center of humane culture? When we started to study humane communities, now we define humane communities as the presence of leaders, institutions, and policies working collaboratively across social and political systems to create sustainable human, animal, and environmental welfare. What we're really looking for is transdisciplinary leadership in and around these. When we study these ideas, in ways, for example, the picture you're drawing is a rendering of a compassion center in Kansas City. And what we have found is that when we build humane communities, the economic benefits to those communities is substantial. So in other words, we probably have, at this point, many different ways we can talk about the reasons to challenge or confront cruelty. One of them is an economic argument, that these would actually be beneficial for many communities to start to think about organizing themselves around more critical humane principles. I have to show you squirrels throughout the presentation because they're so amazing. 5 minutes, okay, thank you. So obviously, this is what do you think? This is obviously, intended to be a joke of sorts, but there's some significance in the question that I'm asking here, which is, in fact, in the presence of an animal, people see you differently. Now, we have quite a lot of science to suggest in the presence of a safe dog, you're seen as more likable, more approachable, more friendly. And it's not just an impression. In fact, what's happened in the presence of a safe animal is your neurobiology is beginning to change. In the presence of a safe animal, we are more likable, we're more talkative, we're more friendly. We tend to be, in fact, even more optimistic in the presence of other safe animals. So what happens when we're in the presence of animals that are in distress or being treated in cruel ways? So the book that I've just been working on, in fact, Nancy Parrish, who's here, is one of the contributors to this book. This is a collected set of works that examine the roles that animals can play in responding to trauma. We've looked at child developmental trauma, we've looked at post-traumatic stress, and we've also looked at community violence, things like school shootings or even natural disasters. And as it turns out, animals can play a significant role in mediating trauma. Part of that is because we're hardwired to have relationships. And so I think I had an interesting discussion with Steve and Kevin over dinner the other night about whether relationships were part of the argument that could be made for the reasons to provide better protections or rights for animals. And I think one of the things that we probably can begin to do is talk about relationships with other animals differently, or maybe more comprehensively than we have in the past. So these are important relationships in part because animals predict our own well-being. Now, as we start to package this concept, we have this happening in micro ways. This is a therapy session actually with a dog that works with me at the University of Denver. And this concept of neuroception would be pre-conscious awareness of senses of well-being that occur in the presence of an animal that's safe. But what happens, and this is driven by the neurobiology, so I'm going to leave this maybe for our further discussion and keep going here for a moment. Some of the implications for this, by the way, are interventions in child abuse, in schools, in older adults, in loneliness, in homelessness, in pain management, in emotional support, in crisis disasters, in places like central Uganda, where the Big Fix is running a program called the Comfort Dog Project, responding to survivors of the Ugandan Civil War using street dogs as strategies for trauma recovery. So as we move this same question of whether animals' well-being has relevance out to a macro picture, we start to realize that we have reasons to be pissed off that animals are routinely mistreated in this way. So we know that structural violence, one of the ways to undermine societies is to kill its animals and undo the health of its own ecological system. If you wanted to displace an indigenous population, you cut down its forest and you kill its animals, because these are the foundations for safety and well-being in these particular communities. The United States has this history in the killing of the buffalo that undermined the Plains Indians and prevented them from having livelihood. You know, Steve said, the only issue I'll take with Steve tonight is when he said that everyone loves elephants. Well, we're exterminating elephants at the same time. So we have this confusing relationship. I understand what Steve means, because I'm one of those people who knows I love elephants too. And lots of people do have this passion for elephants. Simultaneously, though, we've seen this population of elephants disappear off the planet. In fact, some people would say we have a genocide going on directed at elephants alone. So our colleague, some of whom you know, Mark Beckhoff, talks about this idea of anthropomorphic double talk. In other words, we can see animals when we want to see them, and we can see often that they're thriving and are beautiful, and connections between a mother and a child. We might recognize our own emotions in a picture like this, but we might not want to recognize when we look at cruelty. And I think one of the interesting and challenging questions, and I've always been so amazed by Steve's tenacity and good patience, kind of good sportsmanship, if you will, because I don't know if I could do it that same way. For me, this really pisses me off. So as we start to look at these concepts of animals who are thriving or animals who are in distress, we need to be aware that there's consequences to our own health and well-being, including farmed animals. Ag-gag laws, or the rules that prevent us from even talking about cruelty, are suggesting that we have these power structures in place. Steve talked about happy. Happy, we know, has, as a result of being an important candidate in helping develop this sense or awareness of self, as a result is kept in isolation, or maybe not as a result. So lastly, I just want to suggest that I think Steve is actually absolutely right that the framework of, let's say, challenging captivity or incarceration or slavery, that these are intersectional issues, and there's many of them that are intersectional issues that both impact animal welfare and animal well-being. This was one of the most controversial Hustler magazines that was ever published in the United States. But it probably shouldn't be as controversial as the fact that 1 in 3 women worldwide are targets of gender violence. We have killing games that go on, and now we have wolves that are targets of torture by those anti-government activists that see the reintroduction of the wolf as government overreach and are targeting wolves as the symbol of government. Elephant genocide. This is the Front Range of Colorado. This is where I live. What you're looking at here is the presence of oil wells that have been drilled. And there's always a discussion about whether we have our balance right between industry. I was talking to Yoav about this the other night. What's the right balance between protection of the environment and our need for industry and economics? This is what we're facing. Animals pay a price for this. We have post-traumatic stress disorder in birds that are living in close proximity to wells that are probably in need of Steve's service. They need a lawyer, desperately. The baby elephants that are targets of the violence directed at their families, about half of them die as a feature of, not because we don't know what to feed them, but because we can't keep them psychologically healthy. Now, the presence of this violence directed at our planetary health and the biodiversity health across the world has also resulted in now what we call ecoteric disease, or the mental health disorders associated with our exposure to this chronic violence. Solastalgia is a term that was used to reference this concept of being sick, feeling sick, homesick, even when you're home. And what you're looking at here is, by the way, the Horizon oil spill, the coast of the United States that was impacted by this particular oil spill. These are places that when we're familiar with them, we've seen the damage to these ecological systems, do harm that environment But we shouldn't get it wrong in that it's not as though we're not part of that trauma. We are directly impacted by having exposure to this type of violence. So lastly, just to finish up, a couple of things I like to end on positive solutions and ideas. One is Edward Wilson's work called the Half-Earth Proposition, or the 50-50 Proposition, the Half-Earth Project, that's really suggesting that maybe our best efforts should be going towards habitat protection for both humans and animals. And if we protected all the remaining large spaces that are intact, biodiverse, I guess if you could call them intact, that would be the single best way to protect the most animals and protect people. And it's a necessary thing to do right away. So I've started to work in this area of animal protection and animal welfare and human welfare through the lens of rethinking my relationship with other animals. I want to invite you to come to Denver to our events. We have an event on May 14th and 15th called Animals on the Mind, where we're looking at these very issues of how to begin to influence humane communities. In fact, when I get back on Thursday, we have an event called Against Cages and Carceral Logic. That's a shared event between our Institute for Human-Animal Connection and our law school. So the last slide here, the things that I think we might want to talk about as part of this discussion would be our relationships with other animals and recognition that we provide social support for one another and that these are important. The concepts of humane communities, we should probably be talking about these as public health and maybe even human security challenges. We should familiarize ourselves with the relevance of One Health and the One Health sciences as a way of moving forward. We probably should be aware that neuroception is one of the things that's occurring in the presence of all living systems, and that it becomes part of our work, and then starting to invest in strategies like the Half-Earth Proposition. So these are our connections to other animals. As Laurie Gruen would say, we're entangled. We're entangled with other animals. What we do with them is not distant from us. It actually affects our very souls. This is my favorite slide, which is somebody who built a life jacket for a goldfish because its tail wasn't made properly. Why would we be interested in something like that? Well, we know that fish are sentient beings too. All animals have relevance in this discussion, and we probably shouldn't take any of them off the table. So, thank you very much.